Tonight, we're diving into dangerous territory, the space between who you think you are and who you become when nobody's watching. We're talking about projection, self-sabotage, and that peculiar phenomenon where becoming unavailable somehow makes you more magnetic than a therapist's couch on a Monday morning. You know that feeling when you finally stop answering every text immediately, and suddenly everyone thinks you've either achieved enlightenment or joined a cult. Spoiler alert, sometimes there's not much difference. Here's the thing about emotional availability. You've been treating yourself like a 24-hour convenience store, but your soul has banker's hours. And right now you're probably watching this because it's past midnight. Your thoughts are doing that thing where they replay every conversation from 2019, and you're wondering why setting boundaries feels like performing surgery on yourself without anesthesia. You've been conditioned to believe that being constantly accessible is a virtue, that dropping everything for others' needs is love, that sacrificing your own well-being for the comfort of others is nobility. But what if I told you that this isn't love at all? It's a sophisticated form of self-abandonment disguised as virtue. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially at this hour when the rest of the world is either asleep or pretending to have their life together on social media. Turn down the lights, adjust the volume to something that won't wake your existential crisis, and make sure your ego is in airplane mode. We're about to explore what Carl Jung really meant when he talked about individuation and why the path to becoming whole sometimes requires becoming unreachable first. Tonight, you're not just a viewer scrolling through content, you're an explorer venturing into the uncharted territories of your own psyche, armed with nothing but courage and the willingness to see yourself clearly. You're no longer in your bedroom scrolling through your phone at 3 a.m. You're inside the mind of someone who discovered that emotional boundaries aren't walls, they're sacred thresholds. And the good news is that your unconscious mind has been waiting for this conversation. The bad news? It brought receipts from every time you said yes when you meant no, and it's not leaving until you acknowledge them. This isn't just about saying no to others. It's about saying yes to a version of yourself that you've been betraying for years in the name of being good. This video is for those of you who are bone-deep tired of being everyone's emotional support system, while your own inner world crumbles like a cookie in the rain. For those who've realized that being nice has become a prison sentence, and helping others has become a way to avoid helping yourself. If you've ever felt like you're performing your own personality for an audience that doesn't even applaud, this is your sanctuary. If you've discovered that your empathy has become contaminated with resentment, that your giving has become compulsive rather than generous, that your love has become transactional rather than transformative, then you're ready for this conversation. The journey we're embarking on tonight isn't about becoming cold or callous. It's about discovering the difference between authentic compassion and codependent caretaking, between genuine availability and anxious accommodation, between conscious love and unconscious addiction to being needed. We're going to explore what happens when you stop being accessible to everyone and everything, and start being available only to what serves your highest evolution and deepest truth. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But tonight we're going deeper. We're exploring what happens when you stop being irritated by others because you've finally become unreachable to their chaos. We're talking about the profound transformation that occurs when you withdraw not out of anger or spite, but out of a deep, cellular need to remember who you are beneath all the roles you've been performing. Let me paint you a picture of what I call frequency begging, a phenomenon so pervasive in our culture that most people don't even recognize they're doing it. Imagine your energetic field as a radio station that's been broadcasting on a frequency of desperation for so long that you've forgotten what your natural signal sounds like. This frequency sends out constant transmissions. Please see me, please value me, please don't leave me. Please tell me I matter. Please confirm that I exist. Please validate that I'm worthy of love. This isn't conscious begging. You're not walking around explicitly asking for validation. But your energy field, Your nervous system, your very presence is radiating a subtle but persistent plea for recognition, approval, and reassurance. It's like having a dog whistle for dysfunction. It attracts people who feed on your availability, who mistake your accessibility for weakness, who confuse your openness with emptiness they can fill with their own chaos and unprocessed emotions. Think about the last time you sent a text message and then found yourself obsessively checking to see if it had been read, if it had been responded to, analyzing the response time, the tone, the emoji choice. That anxious monitoring isn't love, it's frequency begging. You're energetically asking the other person to regulate your emotional state, to confirm your worth, to prove that you matter by how quickly and enthusiastically they respond to your communication. Or consider how you feel when someone doesn't immediately return your call, when they take longer than usual to respond to your message, when they seem less enthusiastic in their interactions with you than they were last week. That spike of anxiety, that immediate storytelling about what it means about you, about the relationship, about your value, that's your frequency begging for reassurance that you're still worthy of attention and care. Jung understood that the psyche operates according to what he called compensation. When we're overly identified with one aspect of ourselves, the unconscious will compensate by constellating the opposite. If you're consciously identified as the giver, the helper, the always available one, your unconscious is compensating by creating situations that force you to confront your own neediness, your own hunger for recognition, your own desperate desire to be special to someone. This compensation often shows up as attracting people who are emotionally unavailable, narcissistic, or abusive. Your conscious mind thinks you're being loving and generous, but your unconscious is drawing in people who will force you to feel the very abandonment and rejection that you're trying to avoid by being constantly available. It's as if your psyche is saying, "You think you don't need anything from anyone? Let me show you exactly how much you need by putting you in relationship with people who can't or won't meet your needs." The first transformation that occurs when you begin to consciously withdraw your availability is that this frequency of begging begins to shift. But here's what's crucial to understand. It doesn't shift because you're trying to manipulate others into wanting you more. It shifts because you're finally creating space to hear your own signal beneath all the static of other people's needs and opinions. When you stop constantly reaching out, constantly checking in, constantly being available for everyone else's emotional emergencies, you create what acoustic engineers call signal clarity. Just as a recording studio needs silence to capture pure sound, your psyche needs periods of social silence to remember its own natural frequency. The energetic signature you emit when you're not performing, not accommodating, not trying to be anything other than what you naturally are. This natural frequency is what Jung called the self with a capital S, not the ego self that's constantly seeking validation, but the deeper self that already knows its worth, that doesn't need external confirmation to feel valuable, that can exist in solitude without feeling abandoned or incomplete. This self has been broadcasting all along, but its signal has been drowned out by the anxious static of trying to be loved, needed, and approved of by others. Most people are terrified of accessing this natural frequency because they've been conditioned to believe that their worth is dependent on external validation. They've learned that love is something that must be earned through service, that value must be proven through availability, that significance must be demonstrated through being indispensable to others. The idea that they might be inherently worthy, naturally valuable, intrinsically lovable without doing anything at all feels both too good to be true and too dangerous to believe. But Jung's entire body of work points toward this radical possibility, that each person is born with an inherent wholeness, a natural completeness, a fundamental okayness that doesn't depend on anyone else's recognition or approval. The process of individuation, becoming who you truly are, involves stripping away all the false identities, compensatory behaviors, and adaptive strategies that you've developed to try to secure love and belonging from others. When your frequency stops begging, several things happen simultaneously. First, you stop attracting people who are energetically feeding off your need for validation. The emotional vampires, the narcissists, the perpetual victims, the crisis addicts, They lose interest in you because you're no longer providing the energetic supply they're unconsciously seeking. Your desperation was like honey to these wounded individuals. When that desperation disappears, they naturally gravitate toward other sources of supply. Second, you begin to attract people who are operating from their own sense of wholeness rather than from their wounds. These individuals don't need you to be constantly available because they're not using relationship as a way to avoid themselves. They appreciate your presence when you're present, but they don't collapse when you're absent. They enjoy your energy when you're engaged, but they don't take your withdrawal personally or interpret it as rejection. Third, and perhaps most importantly, you develop what I call energetic sovereignty, the ability to maintain your own emotional state regardless of what's happening in your external environment. When you're constantly available, you're like an emotional sponge absorbing everything from everyone's energy field. Their anxiety becomes your anxiety. Their chaos becomes your chaos. Their emergency becomes your emergency. Their mood determines your mood. Their approval determines your self-worth. Energetic sovereignty means you can witness someone's pain without making it your responsibility to fix it. You can hold space for someone's struggle without feeling compelled to solve it. You can offer support without sacrificing your own stability. You can love someone without losing yourself in the process. This kind of centered presence is infinitely more helpful than anxious availability, but it can only be developed through periods of conscious withdrawal from the constant demand to be everything to everyone. The practice of becoming unreachable isn't about building walls around your heart. It's about developing what Buddhists call discrimination, the wisdom to know when to engage and when to withdraw, when to give and when to receive, when to speak and when to remain silent. It's about learning to trust your own inner guidance, about where to invest your precious life force, rather than automatically saying yes to every request for your time, energy, and attention. This discrimination develops naturally when you create space between yourself and the constant demands of others. In that space, you begin to notice patterns that were invisible when you were caught up in them. You see how certain people or situations consistently leave you feeling drained, depleted, or emotionally dysregulated. You observe how your own need for approval drives you to accept treatment that doesn't honor your worth. You recognize the difference between genuine requests for support and manipulative demands for attention. Jung believed that this kind of conscious observation was essential for psychological development. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." When you're constantly available to others, you're unconsciously living out patterns that were probably established in early childhood. Patterns of earning love through service, avoiding abandonment through accommodation, securing attachment through self-sacrifice. These patterns feel like fate because they're so automatic, so deeply ingrained, so much a part of your identity that you can't imagine living differently. But when you create space through conscious unavailability, these patterns become visible. You can see them operating rather than being operated by them. You can choose different responses rather than automatically engaging in the same old dynamics. The frequency that emerges when you stop begging for validation is what mystics throughout history have called presence. It's not something you do. It's something you are when you're not trying to be anything else. It's the natural radiance of a being who has come home to themselves, who has remembered their own worth, who has stopped looking outside themselves for confirmation of their value. This presence is magnetic in a completely different way than neediness. Neediness repels even as it clings. It creates the very abandonment it's trying to avoid by making others feel responsible for your emotional state. But presence attracts through its own fullness rather than its emptiness. It draws others not because they feel needed, but because they feel nourished by being in your energy field. When you embody this kind of presence, people want to be around you not because you solve their problems or meet their needs, but because your very being reminds them of their own possibility for wholeness. You become a mirror that reflects back their own inherent worth rather than a source that they need to drain to feel valuable themselves. Jung talked extensively about the persona, the mask we wear in social situations, the carefully curated version of ourselves we present to the world to gain acceptance and avoid rejection. But what he didn't explicitly address, though it runs through all his work, is what I call the accessibility persona, the version of yourself that's always available, always responsive, always ready to drop everything for someone else's emergency. This isn't just people-pleasing. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be valuable, lovable, and worthy of respect. The accessibility persona is perhaps the most socially rewarded form of false identity in our culture. You get praised for being so giving, so caring, so selfless. People depend on you, look up to you, tell others what a good person you are. Your family, friends, and colleagues all benefit from your constant availability, so they actively reinforce this identity through appreciation, gratitude, and subtle or not so subtle guilt when you're not as accessible as they've come to expect. But here's what nobody tells you about the accessibility persona. It's not actually based on love or generosity. It's based on terror. Terror of being abandoned, rejected, forgotten, or deemed unworthy. Terror that if you're not constantly useful, you'll be discarded. Terror that your natural self, the one with needs, boundaries, limits, and preferences, is somehow fundamentally unacceptable and must be hidden behind a mask of endless availability. This terror is usually rooted in early experiences where love felt conditional on being good, where acceptance seemed dependent on not having needs of your own, where belonging required you to be the solution to other people's problems rather than a person with your own inner world worth exploring and honoring. These experiences teach you that your authentic self is somehow flawed, selfish, or burdensome, and that you must compensate for these perceived defects by being extraordinarily accommodating. The accessibility persona becomes so deeply ingrained that you often don't realize you're wearing it. It feels like your natural personality, your genuine character, your authentic way of being in the world. The idea of not being constantly available feels foreign, selfish, even cruel. You've been performing this role for so long that you've forgotten it's a performance. The mask has become so familiar that you mistake it for your face. But Jung understood that every persona, no matter how socially rewarded, eventually becomes a prison. He wrote, "The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society, fittingly enough a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual. The accessibility persona makes a definite impression that you're loving, generous, dependable, while concealing your true nature, which includes the need for solitude, rest, boundaries, and reciprocity." The death of the accessibility persona doesn't happen all at once. It's a gradual process that usually begins with exhaustion. You reach a point where you literally cannot give any more without completely depleting yourself. Your body starts sending signals: chronic fatigue, mysterious illnesses, anxiety disorders, depression, insomnia, digestive issues. Your nervous system, which has been in a constant state of hypervigilance, always scanning for who might need you, always ready to jump into action, begins to revolt. This exhaustion is not a character flaw or a sign of weakness. It's your psyche's wisdom, attempting to force you to confront the unsustainability of living in constant betrayal of your own needs. Jung called this the breakdown that leads to breakthrough, the psychological crisis that forces conscious confrontation with unconscious patterns that are no longer serving your development. But even when the exhaustion becomes undeniable, dismantling the accessibility persona feels terrifying because it seems to threaten your entire sense of identity and worth. If you're not the person everyone can count on, who are you? If you're not constantly available to help, what value do you bring to relationships? If you start saying no to requests for your time and energy, will anyone still want to be around you? These fears reveal how deeply the accessibility persona has infiltrated your sense of self. You've become convinced that your worth is directly proportional to your availability, that love is measured by how much you sacrifice for others, that your value lies in what you can provide rather than who you inherently are. The thought of people loving you for yourself rather than for your services feels both impossible and terrifying. The process of dismantling this persona requires what Jung called conscious suffering, the willingness to experience the discomfort of disappointing others, of being misunderstood, of having your motives questioned, of being called selfish or uncaring by people who have benefited from your excessive availability. This suffering is conscious because you're choosing it deliberately rather than unconsciously acting it out through symptoms, relationship drama, or self-destructive behaviors. One of the most challenging aspects of this process is recognizing how much of your identity has been built on being needed rather than being valued for who you are. When you start becoming less available, you discover which relationships were based on your utility and which were based on genuine appreciation for your authentic self. This can be a devastating revelation because it means accepting that some people in your life don't actually know you. They know the services you provide, the role you play in their lives, the functions you serve in their emotional ecosystem. You might discover that your family expects you to be the eternal caretaker, organizing gatherings, mediating conflicts, providing emotional support, remembering birthdays, maintaining connections between people who don't make effort with each other. When you start stepping back from these roles, you're often met with confusion, guilt-tripping, or accusations of selfishness. The people who have benefited from your excessive availability rarely respond well to your newfound boundaries. In romantic relationships, the death of the accessibility persona can be particularly challenging because it often reveals the unconscious contracts that have been operating beneath the surface. You might realize that your partner fell in love with your willingness to adapt to their needs rather than with your authentic preferences. They might be attracted to your flexibility, your accommodating nature, your ability to make their life easier, rather than to your genuine personality, values, or dreams. When you start expressing authentic preferences, setting boundaries around your time and energy, or requiring reciprocity in the relationship, your partner might resist these changes. They might interpret your growing self-respect as rejection of them, your boundaries as walls, your need for space as abandonment. This is because they've become addicted to your accessibility in the same way that you've become addicted to being needed. In friendships, the accessibility persona often manifests as being the friend everyone calls in a crisis, but who rarely receives the same level of support in return. You're the one who drops everything to help, who listens for hours to the same problems without judgment, who provides advice and emotional labor without expecting reciprocity. When you start requiring mutuality in your friendships, some people will struggle to adjust to this new dynamic. The death of the accessibility persona also requires grieving the version of yourself that you've been for so long. Even though this persona was ultimately limiting and unsustainable, it was also familiar. It provided a sense of purpose, identity, and belonging, even if that belonging was based on false premises. Letting go of this identity can feel like a death because, in many ways, it is one. You're allowing a version of yourself to die so that a more authentic version can be born. This grief is complicated because it's the loss of something that was never real to begin with. You're mourning an identity that was constructed to gain love rather than express love, built to avoid rejection rather than attract genuine connection, designed to feel valuable rather than recognize inherent worth. It's the grief of realizing how much of your life has been spent performing rather than being, giving rather than receiving, accommodating rather than authentically expressing. Jung understood that this kind of psychological death is necessary for individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are rather than who you think you need to be loved. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But becoming who you truly are requires releasing who you've been pretending to be, even when that pretense has been rewarded by others." The accessibility persona dies not through force or willpower, but through the gentle, consistent practice of honoring your own needs and preferences. It dies through learning to say no without elaborate explanations or apologies. It dies through choosing solitude when you need space rather than accepting every social invitation. It dies through asking for help when you need support rather than always being the helper. Most importantly, it dies through the radical recognition that you are worthy of love and respect simply because you exist, not because of what you do for others. This recognition usually comes in moments of profound stillness, when you're alone with yourself without any role to play or function to serve. In these moments, you might glimpse the person you are beneath all the performance. Curious, sensitive, creative, complex, worthy of care and consideration. As the accessibility persona dies, space is created for your authentic self to emerge. This authentic self has preferences that aren't based on what others want. It has boundaries that aren't negotiable. It has needs that require attention and care. It has a rhythm that doesn't always align with others' urgency. It has depths that can't be accessed through casual availability. This emerging authentic self might be quieter than your persona, less immediately impressive, less obviously useful to others. It might need more time alone, more space to process experiences, more selectivity about who has access to your inner world. It might be more complex, more contradictory, more human than the simplified version of yourself that was always available to meet others' needs. The death of the accessibility persona is ultimately a resurrection, the resurrection of your true self from beneath the layers of adaptive strategies, compensatory behaviors, and false identities that you developed to survive in a world that taught you that love was conditional on being endlessly available. This resurrection doesn't happen overnight, and it's not a linear process. It's a gradual awakening to the reality that you are inherently valuable, naturally lovable, and worthy of the same care and consideration that you've been giving so freely to others. Perhaps the most difficult skill to develop on the journey towards psychological wholeness is what Jung called conscious cruelty, the ability to say no, set boundaries, and disappoint people when necessary, without being destroyed by guilt or the compulsive need to explain yourself. This isn't cruelty in the sadistic sense. It's the kind of surgical precision that a doctor uses when removing something that's causing harm. It's the willingness to cause short-term discomfort in service of long-term health and authenticity. Most people who struggle with availability, addiction have been conditioned to believe that disappointing others is the worst thing they can do. They've been taught that love means never saying no, that kindness requires self-sacrifice, that being good means being endlessly accommodating. These beliefs make it impossible to maintain healthy boundaries because every act of self-preservation feels like an act of betrayal. Every moment of unavailability feels like abandonment. Every assertion of personal needs feels like selfishness. But Jung understood that sometimes love requires disappointing people. Sometimes kindness means refusing to enable dysfunction. Sometimes being good means being unavailable to what's not good for you. This conscious cruelty is actually the highest form of compassion because it prevents the kind of resentment, exhaustion, and emotional burnout that ultimately destroys relationships and damages everyone involved. The term conscious cruelty might seem harsh, but it's important to understand what Jung meant by this concept. He was referring to the deliberate choice to prioritize truth over comfort, authenticity over approval, long-term well-being over short-term peace. It's conscious because you're making this choice deliberately, with full awareness of the discomfort it will cause both for yourself and others. It's cruelty only in the sense that it refuses to participate in the unconscious, agreements that keep dysfunctional patterns alive. Most people practice unconscious cruelty all the time. They say yes when they mean no, then act out their resentment through passive-aggressive behavior, emotional withdrawal, or explosive outbursts. They agree to things they don't want to. Do then punish others through their martyrdom, their suffering, their subtle communications of how much they're sacrificing. This unconscious cruelty is far more damaging than honest, direct communication about your limits and boundaries. Conscious cruelty, by contrast, is clean. It's honest. It's direct. It says no without elaborate explanations or apologies. It sets boundaries without justification or negotiation. It disappoints people without taking responsibility for their emotional reactions. It prioritizes authenticity over the temporary discomfort that comes from not meeting others' expectations. Learning to practice conscious cruelty requires a fundamental shift in how you understand responsibility. Most people who struggle with boundaries have been trained to feel responsible for other people's emotions, reactions, and well-being. They believe that if someone is upset by their choices, they've done something wrong. They think that causing disappointment makes them bad people, that saying no makes them selfish, that prioritizing their own needs makes them cruel. But Jung understood that each person is ultimately responsible for their own emotional state, their own reactions, their own ability to cope with disappointment and frustration. Taking responsibility for others' emotions isn't love. It's a form of unconscious superiority that assumes others are incapable of handling reality, unable to cope with not getting what they want, too fragile to handle honest communication about your limits. The practice of conscious cruelty begins with the recognition that your availability is not a human right that others can claim. Your time, energy, attention, and emotional labor are precious resources that belong to you. You have the right to allocate these resources according to your own values, priorities, and well-being, rather than according to others' demands, expectations, or emergencies. This might sound obvious, but for many people who struggle with boundaries, this is a revolutionary concept. They've been trained to believe that their resources belong to whoever needs them most, that their own preferences are less important than others' comfort, that their well-being is secondary to maintaining harmony and avoiding conflict. They've learned to treat themselves as a public utility rather than a sovereign being with rights and preferences. Conscious cruelty requires what I call radical self-ownership, the willingness to claim full authority over your own life, choices, and energy. This means recognizing that you don't owe anyone explanations for your decisions, justifications for your boundaries, or apologies for your unavailability. You don't have to convince others that your needs are valid or your limits are reasonable. You simply have to honor them. This radical self-ownership is terrifying for most people because it means taking full responsibility for your own life rather than letting others' needs and expectations determine your choices. It means trusting your own judgment rather than constantly seeking external validation for your decisions. It means being willing to be misunderstood, criticized, or rejected rather than compromising your integrity to maintain others' approval. One of the most challenging aspects of practicing conscious cruelty is learning to tolerate other people's disappointment without immediately rushing to fix it, explain it away, or compensate for it through increased availability in other areas. When you say no to someone who's used to your automatic yes, they might express hurt, confusion, anger, or guilt-inducing comments about how they thought they could count on you. Your conditioning will immediately activate, flooding you with guilt and the compulsive need to make them feel better. Every fiber of your being will want to explain why you're saying no, to apologize for disappointing them, to offer alternative forms of help, or to compromise your boundary to ease their discomfort. This is the moment where conscious cruelty is most necessary, the willingness to let others be disappointed without making their disappointment your emergency. Jung understood that this ability to tolerate others' discomfort without taking responsibility for it is essential for psychological maturity. He wrote about the importance of holding the tension, allowing difficult emotions and situations to exist without immediately rushing to resolve them. When you practice conscious cruelty, you're holding the tension between your need for boundaries and others' desire for your constant availability. This tension is uncomfortable for everyone involved, but it's also transformative. It forces others to develop their own coping skills rather than relying on your availability as their primary source of support. It teaches them that you're a person with your own needs and limits, rather than a resource to be consumed. It creates space for more authentic relationships based on mutual respect, rather than one-sided accommodation. The practice of conscious cruelty also requires developing what I call disappointment immunity, the ability to disappoint others without interpreting their reaction as evidence that you're a bad person. Most people who struggle with boundaries have been trained to believe that causing disappointment is proof of their selfishness, that making others unhappy makes them responsible for that unhappiness, that prioritizing their own needs is inherently wrong. Disappointment immunity comes from the deep recognition that disappointing others is an inevitable part of being an authentic human being. You cannot live according to your own values, pursue your own dreams, honor your own limits, and maintain your own well-being without sometimes disappointing people who want something different from you. The alternative, living to avoid ever disappointing anyone, is not actually virtuous. It's a form of self-betrayal that ultimately serves no one. When you develop disappointment immunity, you can remain centered and compassionate even when others are upset by your choices. You can acknowledge their disappointment, without making it your responsibility to fix it. You can empathize with their feelings without changing your decision to honor your own needs. You can care about their well-being without sacrificing your own in service of their comfort. This doesn't mean becoming callous or indifferent to others' feelings. It means developing the emotional maturity to distinguish between empathy and enmeshment, between caring and caretaking, between love and codependence. You can care deeply about someone while still maintaining your own boundaries. You can love someone without making their happiness your responsibility. One of the most powerful aspects of conscious cruelty is that it actually teaches others how to treat you with respect. When you consistently honor your own boundaries, you train others to respect those boundaries. When you refuse to accept treatment that doesn't honor your worth, you teach others that you won't tolerate disrespect. When you prioritize your own well-being, you model what healthy self-care looks like. Most people don't realize that their excessive availability actually teaches others to take them for granted. When you're always available, always accommodating, always willing to sacrifice your own needs for others' comfort, you're unconsciously communicating that your time isn't valuable, your energy is unlimited, and your needs don't matter. This training creates relationships where others feel entitled to your availability and become upset when you're not as accessible as they expect. Conscious cruelty disrupts this dynamic by establishing that your availability is a gift, not a given. It teaches others that access to your time and energy is something to be appreciated rather than assumed. It creates relationships based on mutual consideration rather than one-sided accommodation. The practice of conscious cruelty also reveals which relationships in your life are based on genuine love and which are based on utility. When you start setting boundaries and becoming less available, some people will adjust to this new dynamic and find ways to connect with you that honor your limits. These are the relationships worth preserving and deepening. Others will resist your boundaries, guilt-trip you for your unavailability, or fade away when you're no longer serving their unconscious needs. This discovery can be painful, but it's also liberating. It frees you from investing your precious life force in relationships that were never actually about loving you for who you are. Jung believed that this process of differentiation, separating authentic connections from functional relationships, was essential for individuation. He understood that becoming who you truly are requires releasing relationships that are based on who you've been pretending to be. This doesn't mean cutting people off harshly or burning bridges unnecessarily, but it does mean allowing relationships to find their natural level based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than need and accommodation. The ultimate goal of conscious cruelty isn't to become mean or selfish. It's to become authentic in your connections with others. When you're willing to disappoint people who want you to be someone you're not, you create space for relationships with people who appreciate who you actually are. When you stop trying to be everything to everyone, you can be genuinely present for the people who matter most. This authenticity is what Jung meant when he wrote about conscious relationship. Connection that's based on truth rather than need, on appreciation rather than utility, on choice rather than compulsion. These relationships can withstand disappointment, disagreement, and the natural fluctuations of human availability because they're built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine care rather than on the fragile ground of constant accommodation. Learning to practice conscious cruelty is one of the most loving things you can do for yourself and others. It honors your own worth while teaching others to honor it as well. It creates relationships based on authenticity rather than performance. It allows you to give from overflow rather than from depletion. Most importantly, it frees you from the exhausting prison of trying to be everything to everyone and allows you to discover who you truly are when you're not constantly performing for others' approval. In our hyper-connected culture, solitude has become almost a lost art. We've been conditioned to believe that being alone is a problem to be solved, a void to be filled, a state of deprivation that should be endured only until we can return to the company of others. But Jung understood that solitude isn't the absence of connection. It's a different kind of presence, a sacred communion with the deeper aspects of yourself that can only be accessed when you're not performing, accommodating, or responding to others' needs and expectations. When you become unreachable, when you consciously choose periods of unavailability, you're not running away from relationship. You're entering into the most important relationship of your life, the relationship with yourself. This isn't the surface-level self that's always adapting to circumstances, but the deeper self that Jung wrote about, the eternal, unchanging essence of who you are beneath all the roles, identities, and personas you've developed to navigate the world. Most people are terrified of solitude because they've never learned to enjoy their own company. They've been so busy being what others need them to be that they've lost touch with who they are when nobody's watching. They've become strangers to themselves, uncomfortable with their own thoughts, anxious in their own presence, desperate for external stimulation or validation to avoid the intensity of being alone with their authentic feelings and experiences. This terror of solitude is actually a terror of authenticity. When you're alone, really alone, you can't hide behind roles or masks. You're confronted with your unfiltered thoughts, your genuine emotions, your real desires and fears. There's no audience to perform for, no one to impress or accommodate, no external validation to seek. You're face to face with the person you are when you're not trying to be anything for anyone else. This confrontation with your authentic self can be overwhelming at first because you discover that beneath all the performance and accommodation, there's a vast inner world that you've been neglecting. There are dreams you've abandoned, feelings you've suppressed, aspects of your personality that you've hidden because they didn't fit the image of who you thought you needed to be loved and accepted. Jung called this process active imagination, the conscious dialogue with the unconscious parts of yourself that have been split off through years of adaptation and people-pleasing. When you're constantly available to others, you're unavailable to these disowned aspects of yourself. They don't disappear. They go underground, where they continue to influence your behavior through symptoms, projections, and repetitive patterns that you can't understand or control. In the fertile darkness of chosen solitude, these split-off parts finally have space to emerge and be heard. The angry part that's been suppressed because anger isn't nice or spiritual, the selfish part that's been rejected because wanting things for yourself isn't socially acceptable. The wild part that's been tamed because authentic expression isn't always appropriate. The sad part that's been medicated because grief disrupts the productivity culture demands. Active imagination requires the kind of deep listening that's impossible when you're constantly responding to external demands. It's in this unreachable space that you can finally have the conversations with yourself that you've been avoiding for years. You can ask the angry part what it's protecting, what boundaries it's trying to establish. You can inquire with the sad part about what losses it's grieving, what completions it needs. You can dialogue with the wild part about what authentic expression is seeking to emerge. This process of inner dialogue and integration is what Jung meant by individuation. It's not about becoming perfect or eliminating your shadow. It's about becoming whole by acknowledging and integrating all aspects of yourself, including the ones that don't fit society's definition of acceptable behavior. It's about developing what he called conscious suffering, the willingness to feel everything without immediately rushing to fix, change, or escape from whatever is arising. Most people avoid this kind of deep inner work because it requires a level of emotional courage that our culture doesn't teach or support. We're trained to immediately seek solutions, distractions, or medications when uncomfortable feelings arise, rather than learning to be present with whatever is happening in our inner world. We're taught that pain is always a problem to be solved, rather than sometimes being information to be received. But Jung understood that psychological development requires what he called holding the tension, allowing difficult emotions and internal conflicts to exist without immediately rushing to resolve them. When you're alone with yourself, really alone, you develop the capacity to witness your own psychological processes without being completely identified with them. You learn to observe your thoughts without believing them all, to feel your emotions without being overwhelmed by them, to notice your patterns without being enslaved by them. This witnessing capacity is perhaps the most valuable skill you can develop, and it can only be cultivated in solitude. When you're constantly interacting with others, You're always in reactive mode, always responding to external stimuli, always adapting to circumstances. There's no space for the kind of objective observation that allows you to see your own psychological patterns clearly. In solitude, you begin to notice things about yourself that were invisible when you were caught up in the drama of constant interaction. You see how certain thoughts trigger specific emotional responses. You observe how your energy naturally fluctuates throughout the day. You recognize the difference between intuitive guidance and anxious rumination. You develop what mystics call witness consciousness, the ability to be present with your own experience without being completely merged with it. This witnessing capacity is what allows true choice to emerge. When you can observe your patterns without being completely identified with them, you can choose different responses. You can feel anger without acting on it destructively. You can experience sadness without drowning in despair. You can notice fear without being paralyzed by anxiety. You become the conscious observer of your own psychological processes rather than their unconscious victim. The alchemy of solitude transforms not just your relationship with yourself, but your capacity for authentic relationship with others. When you're comfortable being alone, you stop using relationships to escape from yourself. You stop needing others to entertain you, validate you, or complete you. You can be present with others from a place of fullness rather than emptiness, choice rather than neediness, genuine interest rather than desperate hunger for connection. This transformation changes the quality of your relationships completely. Instead of unconsciously using others to avoid your own inner world, you can consciously choose to share your inner world with others. Instead of expecting relationships to fill the emptiness inside you, you can bring your own fullness to the connection. Instead of demanding that others complete you, you can appreciate them for who they are rather than what they can provide. People can sense this difference immediately. When someone is comfortable in their own solitude, they emanate a quality of presence that's both magnetic and non-demanding. They're genuinely interested in others because they're not desperately seeking something from them. They can listen deeply because they're not constantly preparing their next response or seeking validation for their own experiences. This kind of presence is rare in our culture because most people are uncomfortable with silence, with stillness, with the absence of external stimulation. They fill every moment with noise, activity, interaction, or distraction to avoid the intensity of being fully present with themselves. But those who have learned to embrace solitude bring a quality of centered calm to all their interactions that others find both soothing and inspiring. The practice of conscious solitude also reconnects you with your natural creativity. When you're constantly responding to others' needs and expectations, your creative energy is always being channeled into solving their problems, managing their emotions, or meeting their demands. There's no psychic space left for your own creative expression, your own innovative thinking, your own artistic impulses. But in the spaciousness of chosen solitude, your creativity naturally begins to flow again. Ideas that have been dormant start to percolate. Projects that seemed impossible suddenly feel achievable. You remember interests and passions that got buried under the weight of being constantly available to others. You reconnect with parts of yourself that are purely creative, expressive, and generative, rather than reactive and accommodating. This creative renaissance isn't just about artistic endeavors, though it often includes them. It's about approaching your entire life as a creative project, designing your days according to your own rhythms rather than others' urgencies, making choices based on your authentic preferences rather than external expectations, creating a lifestyle that reflects your values rather than social conditioning. Jung believed that this creative expression was essential for psychological health. He understood that each person has a unique contribution to make to the world, but this contribution can only emerge when they're connected to their own authentic nature rather than constantly adapting to others' demands. The individuation process involves discovering and expressing this unique essence, but it requires periods of solitude to hear the subtle voice of your own creative guidance. The alchemy of solitude also develops what I call emotional sovereignty, the ability to be the primary source of your own emotional regulation rather than depending on others to manage your feelings. When you're constantly around people, it's easy to become addicted to external sources of comfort, validation, or excitement. You start to believe that you need others to feel good, that their presence is required for your happiness, that their absence means deprivation. But when you learn to enjoy your own company, you discover that you have everything you need within yourself to feel content, peaceful, and fulfilled. This doesn't mean becoming isolated or self-sufficient to the point of never needing anyone. It means developing the internal resources to be genuinely okay whether you're alone or with others, whether you're in relationship or single, whether you're socially engaged or in periods of withdrawal. This emotional sovereignty is incredibly liberating because it frees you from the unconscious need to manage others' emotions to maintain your own stability. When you're not dependent on others for your emotional well-being, you can love them more freely. You can allow them to have their own feelings without making those feelings your responsibility. You can support them without being destabilized by their struggles. The transformation that occurs through conscious solitude is ultimately a return to your original nature. The person you were before you learned that love had to be earned through service, that value had to be proven through availability, that worth had to be demonstrated through self-sacrifice. It's a homecoming to the part of yourself that knows it's inherently valuable, naturally lovable, and worthy of the same care and consideration that you've been giving so freely to others. This return to original nature doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process of peeling away the layers of adaptation, accommodation, and false identity that you've accumulated over years of trying to be who you thought others needed you to be. Each layer that falls away reveals more of your authentic self, sometimes beautiful, sometimes challenging, always real. The practice of solitude becomes a sacred ritual of self-discovery, self-acceptance, and self-integration. It's time set aside for the most important relationship in your life, the relationship with yourself. In this relationship, you learn to be patient with your own process, compassionate with your own struggles, curious about your own complexity. You discover that you're actually quite interesting company when you're not performing for an audience. Your thoughts, when you're not censoring them for others' comfort, reveal depths of wisdom, creativity, and insight that surprise you. Your emotions, when you're not suppressing them to maintain social harmony, provide valuable information about your needs, boundaries, and authentic responses to life. Your intuition, when you're not drowning it out with constant external input, proves to be a reliable guide for decisions both large and small. Your natural rhythms, when you're not forcing them to accommodate others' schedules, reveal a perfect timing for work, rest, social engagement, and solitude that supports your optimal functioning. The alchemy of solitude ultimately transforms isolation into integration, loneliness into wholeness, emptiness into fullness. You realize that you were never actually alone. You were simply disconnected from yourself. When you reconnect with your own depths, you discover an infinite source of wisdom, creativity, and love that has been waiting patiently for your attention. This internal connection becomes the foundation for all your external relationships. When you know how to nourish yourself, you can genuinely nourish others. When you can provide your own comfort, you can offer authentic support. When you've learned to love your own company, you can truly appreciate the company of others without needing them to complete or validate you. The sacred communion with self that develops through conscious solitude is perhaps the greatest gift you can give to the world. Every person who learns to be genuinely okay alone contributes to the collective healing of our species' addiction to external validation and codependent connection. Every individual who becomes comfortable in their own presence gives others permission to explore their own depths. Every soul who transforms isolation into integration demonstrates what authentic self-love looks like in action. There comes a moment in the journey of becoming unreachable when you experience what I call the great shattering. The psychological event when the mirror you've been looking into for years suddenly cracks, and you realize that the reflection you've been seeing was never actually you. It was a composite image made up of other people's expectations, your own adaptive strategies, and a carefully constructed persona designed to gain love and avoid rejection. This shattering is simultaneously devastating and liberating, terrifying, and necessary. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism that emerges from the tension between conscious attitudes and unconscious contents. When you become unreachable, you create the perfect conditions for this transcendent function to activate. The tension between who you've been performing yourself to be and who you actually are becomes so intense that something has to give. Usually, what gives is the illusion of who you thought you were. For most people, this realization comes gradually, then all at once. You might notice small inconsistencies at first, moments when your automatic responses don't feel authentic, times when your usual people-pleasing behaviors leave you feeling empty rather than fulfilled, situations where your accommodating nature feels more like self-abandonment than generosity. These small cracks in your self-image accumulate until one day, usually during a period of solitude or crisis, the entire structure collapses. The collapse often feels like a psychological earthquake. Everything you thought you knew about yourself, everything you believed about your motivations, everything you assumed about your character, suddenly seems questionable. You might realize that your empathy has been contaminated with codependence, that your helpfulness has been driven by a desperate need for validation, that your selflessness has been a sophisticated form of self-abandonment disguised as virtue. This realization can be profoundly disorienting because it means that the story you've been telling yourself about who you are might not be true. The identity you've built, the personality you've cultivated, the reputation you've established, all of it might be based on performance rather than authenticity, on compensation rather than genuine character, on unconscious strategy rather than conscious choice. Jung understood that this kind of psychological crisis was not only inevitable but necessary for individuation. He called it enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposite when taken to an extreme. When you've been extremely available, extremely accommodating, extremely selfless for long enough, the psyche compensates by constellating the opposite, a need for unavailability, boundaries, and self-care that feels foreign and frightening to your conscious mind. The person who emerges from this psychological shattering is often quite different from who you thought you were. You might discover that beneath all the people-pleasing, you're actually quite opinionated. Under all the accommodation, you might find that you have strong preferences and non-negotiable values. Behind all the selflessness, you might uncover a fierce protectiveness of your own time, energy, and well-being. These discoveries can be shocking because they contradict the story you've been telling yourself about your nature. You've identified as the giving one, the understanding one, the flexible one for so long that discovering your own needs, opinions, and boundaries feels like becoming a different person entirely. You might worry that you're becoming selfish, demanding, or difficult when you're actually just becoming real. The mirror breaks most completely in relationships, where your newfound authenticity often reveals the unconscious contracts that have been operating beneath the surface. You might realize that many of your connections have been based on your utility rather than your authentic self. People who seem to love you deeply might become confused, disappointed, or even hostile when you start expressing genuine preferences, setting real boundaries, or requiring reciprocity in the relationship. This can be devastating because it means accepting that some people in your life don't actually know you. They know the role you've been playing, the functions you've been serving, the accommodations you've been making. They've fallen in love with your availability, not your authenticity. They've become attached to your services, not your soul. They've been relating to your persona, not your person. The realization that you've been unknown, even in your closest relationships, can trigger a profound grief. You might mourn the years spent performing rather than being, accommodating rather than expressing, giving rather than receiving. You might grieve the relationships that were built on false foundations, the opportunities for genuine intimacy that were missed because you were too busy being what others needed you to be. But this grief, while painful, is also cleansing. It clears away the illusions that have been keeping you trapped in inauthentic relationships and unfulfilling patterns. It creates space for genuine connections based on who you actually are rather than who you've been pretending to be. It liberates you from the exhausting performance of being someone else's ideal rather than your own authentic self. The breaking of the mirror also reveals the shadow aspects of your personality that you've been repressing or denying. Jung understood that the shadow contains not only the negative qualities we've rejected in ourselves, but also the positive, qualities that we've been taught are inappropriate, dangerous, or selfish. Your ability to say no is in your shadow. Your capacity for healthy selfishness is in your shadow. Your natural protective instincts are in your shadow. These shadow qualities have been banished to the unconscious because they don't fit the image of who you thought you needed to be loved and accepted. But when the mirror breaks, these qualities emerge with a vengeance. You might surprise yourself with how easily you can say no when you stop believing you need to justify your decisions. You might shock others with how firmly you can set boundaries. When you stop apologizing for having needs, you might discover a fierce protectiveness of your own well-being that you never knew existed. The integration of these shadow qualities is essential for psychological wholeness, but it can be challenging because it requires you to embrace aspects of yourself that you've been taught are wrong or bad. It means accepting that you have selfish impulses, aggressive instincts, and protective mechanisms that don't fit the sanitized version of spirituality or kindness that you've been trying to embody. Jung believed that this shadow integration was one of the most important tasks of psychological development. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The darkness he was referring to includes not only your repressed negative qualities, but also your repressed power, your denied strength, your rejected self-respect. The process of shadow integration often begins with acknowledging the parts of yourself that you've been most ashamed of or resistant to. For people-pleasers, this usually includes anger, selfishness, and the desire for recognition or appreciation. These qualities have been so thoroughly rejected that even admitting they exist feels dangerous. But Jung understood that what we resist persists, and what we deny controls us from the unconscious. When you begin to consciously acknowledge and integrate these shadow qualities, something paradoxical happens. They lose their compulsive power over you. The anger that was leaking out through passive-aggressive behavior can be channeled into healthy boundary setting. The selfishness that was manifesting as resentment can be transformed into appropriate self-care. The desire for recognition that was driving compulsive helping can be redirected into authentic self-expression. The breaking of the mirror also forces you to confront the ways in which your identity has been built on being needed rather than being valued for who you are. This realization can be particularly painful because it means acknowledging how much of your self-worth has been dependent on external validation, how much of your sense of purpose has been derived from solving others' problems, how much of your feeling of lovability has been based on your usefulness. This confrontation with your own neediness, the desperate hunger for validation that has been driving your availability addiction, is perhaps the most humbling aspect of the mirror breaking. You realize that your giving hasn't been as pure as you thought, that your helping hasn't been as selfless as you believed, that your love hasn't been as unconditional as you imagined. There's been a transaction happening beneath the surface. You give because you need to be needed. You help because you need to feel valuable. You love because you need to be loved back. This realization doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a human person. Jung understood that all human behavior is multiply determined, that our most generous impulses are often mixed with self-interest, that our most loving actions are usually serving multiple purposes simultaneously. The goal isn't to become perfectly pure in your motivations, but to become conscious of the various factors that drive your behavior so you can make more authentic choices. The breaking of the mirror ultimately serves the purpose of liberation. When you stop seeing yourself through the distorted reflection of others' needs and expectations, you can begin to see yourself clearly for the first time. This clarity is initially shocking because it reveals how much of your life has been spent performing rather than being, accommodating rather than expressing, reacting rather than choosing. But this clarity is also profoundly freeing because it means you can finally stop trying to be someone you're not. You can release the exhausting effort of maintaining a persona that doesn't fit your authentic nature. You can let go of the constant vigilance required to monitor others' reactions. and adjust your behavior accordingly. You can cease the endless accommodation that has been depleting your life force for years. The person who emerges from the broken mirror is raw, more complex, more contradictory than the polished persona you've been maintaining. This authentic self might be quieter or louder than your persona, more sensitive or more assertive, more creative or more practical. It might have needs that feel foreign to your conscious mind, preferences that contradict your previous choices, values that conflict with your conditioning. This emergence of authentic self is what Jung called the birth of the individual, the person who is undivided within themselves, who has integrated their conscious and unconscious qualities, who can be genuinely themselves without apology or performance. This individual is not perfect, they are whole. They are not always pleasant, they are real. They are not constantly available, they are authentically present when they choose to be. The broken mirror cannot be repaired, and this is ultimately a gift. Once you've seen yourself clearly, without the distortion of others' projections and your own adaptive strategies, you can never again pretend to be someone you're not, with complete unconsciousness. You might still fall into old patterns, but you'll be aware that you're doing it. You might still accommodate others occasionally, but you'll know you're making a choice rather than acting from compulsion. This consciousness is what Jung meant by psychological freedom, not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom to choose your responses consciously rather than being driven by unconscious compulsions. When the mirror breaks, you gain access to this freedom because you can finally see the forces that have been shaping your behavior from behind the scenes. The breaking of the mirror is ultimately a death and rebirth experience. The person you thought you were dies, and a more authentic version of yourself is born. This birth is often messy, uncomfortable, and disorienting because you're learning to be someone you've never been allowed to be before. You're discovering preferences you've never acknowledged, setting boundaries you've never maintained, expressing needs you've never admitted. But this birth is also exhilarating because it's the emergence of your true nature from beneath years of conditioning and adaptation. It's the reclamation of your authentic voice after years of saying what others wanted to hear. It's the recovery of your genuine self after years of being what others needed you to be. The journey continues beyond the breaking of the mirror, but everything that follows is different because it's based on truth rather than illusion, authenticity rather than performance, conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion. You might still choose to be generous, helpful, and accommodating sometimes, but these choices will come from fullness rather than emptiness, from strength rather than neediness, from love rather than fear. This is the gift that the broken mirror ultimately provides, the opportunity to live as who you actually are rather than who you think you need to be loved. It's the chance to discover what it feels like to be genuinely known and appreciated for your authentic self rather than valued for the role you play in others' lives. It's the possibility of experiencing love that doesn't require performance, acceptance that doesn't demand accommodation, and connection that doesn't cost you your soul. When you begin to understand the energetic dimensions of human interaction, everything changes. You start to see that every relationship, every conversation, every moment of availability or unavailability involves an exchange of energy that goes far beyond the words being spoken or the actions being taken. Jung touched on this when he wrote about the collective unconscious and the ways in which human beings are connected at levels deeper than conscious awareness. But he didn't fully explore what I call the energetic ecosystem of relationships. Your energy field, that subtle but powerful emanation that surrounds every living being, has been broadcasting a signal for years. If you've been struggling with availability addiction, that signal has likely been one of depletion, desperation, and unconscious hunger for validation. You've been energetically advertising your neediness, your willingness to sacrifice yourself for others' comfort, your desperate desire to be needed and valued. This energetic signal is like a radio frequency that attracts specific types of people and repels others. Those who are drawn to your depleted energy are often individuals who are unconsciously seeking someone to absorb their emotional chaos, solve their problems, or provide the validation and attention they're unable to give themselves. They sense your availability addiction, and unconsciously exploit it, not necessarily out of malice, but because their own wounds are seeking the exact kind of accommodation you've been trained to provide. Meanwhile, people who are operating from their own sense of wholeness and energetic sovereignty are often repelled by the frequency of desperation, even if they can't consciously identify what feels off about your interactions. They sense the underlying neediness beneath your helpfulness, the hidden agenda beneath your generosity, the unconscious transaction that's operating beneath your apparent selflessness. When you become unreachable, when you consciously withdraw your availability and begin to prioritize your own energetic well-being, this broadcast frequency begins to shift. But the transformation isn't immediate, and it's not always comfortable. Initially, your energy field might go through what I call withdrawal symptoms, periods of intense loneliness, anxiety, or emptiness as you detox from the constant stimulation of being needed by others. These withdrawal symptoms are real and can be quite intense because your nervous system has become addicted to the adrenaline rush of being in constant crisis response mode. When someone needs you urgently, when there's an emergency to solve, when you're the hero rushing in to save the day, your body produces a cocktail of stress hormones that can become addictive. The drama, the urgency, the feeling of being indispensable, all of this creates a biochemical high that your system begins to crave. When you withdraw from this pattern, when you stop being available for every crisis and emergency, your nervous system has to recalibrate. You might feel restless, anxious, or even depressed as your body adjusts to operating without the constant stimulation of other people's chaos. You might find yourself checking your phone compulsively, hoping for some crisis to emerge that would justify your return to the familiar pattern of heroic availability. This is why the early stages of becoming unreachable can feel so uncomfortable. You're not just changing your behavior, you're rewiring your nervous system, retraining your energy field, and detoxing from biochemical patterns that have been operating for years or even decades. The discomfort you feel is evidence that real transformation is occurring at the cellular level. Jung understood that psychological transformation involves what he called regression in service of the ego, a temporary return to less sophisticated, psychological functioning that allows for reorganization and eventual progression to a higher level of development. When you become unreachable, you might initially feel more selfish, more needy, more emotionally volatile than you did when you were constantly accommodating others. This isn't evidence that you're becoming a worse person. It's evidence that you're finally allowing suppressed aspects of yourself to surface so they can be integrated. The energetic ecosystem of your relationships begins to shift as your own energy field transforms. People who were drawn to your previous frequency of depletion and availability may become confused, disappointed, or even hostile as you change the energetic contract that was operating between you. They might accuse you of becoming selfish, cold, or uncaring when you're actually just becoming boundaried and self-respecting. These accusations can be particularly challenging because they trigger all your conditioning about being good and loving. Your unconscious mind might interpret their displeasure as evidence that you're doing something wrong, that you're becoming a bad person, that you need to return to your previous patterns of accommodation to restore harmony. But Jung understood that individuation requires the courage to disappoint others when their expectations conflict with your authentic development. The people who react most strongly to your newfound boundaries are often those who have been unconsciously feeding off your depleted energy. Like energy vampires who have become accustomed to a reliable food source, they experience your withdrawal as a threat to their own emotional stability. They might escalate their demands, create new crises, or employ guilt and manipulation to try to restore the old dynamic where you are constantly available to meet their needs. This is where understanding the energetic ecosystem becomes crucial. For your continued development, you need to recognize that their reaction isn't really about you becoming a worse person. It's about them losing access to a source of emotional regulation that they've become dependent on. Their distress is real, but it's not your responsibility to manage it by returning to patterns that deplete your own life force. As your energy field continues to transform through conscious unavailability, you begin to attract different kinds of people and experiences. Those who are drawn to your new frequency are often individuals who are doing their own inner work, who respect boundaries, who understand the value of solitude and self-care. They don't need you to be constantly available because they're not using relationship as a way to avoid their own inner world. These new connections feel different from your previous relationships because they're based on mutual appreciation rather than complementary dysfunction. Instead of being drawn together by unconscious wounds seeking healing through the other person, you're attracted to each other's wholeness, creativity, and authentic self-expression. These relationships can tolerate periods of unavailability because they're not built on the fragile foundation of constant accommodation and reassurance. The transformation of your energetic ecosystem also affects your physical health in profound ways. When you're constantly available to absorb other people's emotional chaos, your nervous system is in a chronic state of hypervigilance. Your adrenal glands are constantly producing stress hormones. Your immune system is compromised by the ongoing activation of fight or flight responses, and your digestive system is disrupted by the chronic tension of never truly relaxing. Many people who struggle with availability addiction also struggle with mysterious physical symptoms that conventional medicine can't fully explain: chronic fatigue, digestive issues, autoimmune conditions, frequent illnesses, sleep disorders, and unexplained pain. These symptoms are often the body's way of trying to force you to create the boundaries that you've been unable to maintain consciously. When you become unreachable, when you prioritize your own energetic well-being, these physical symptoms often begin to improve because your nervous system finally has permission to rest and restore. Your body no longer has to create illness to get you to slow down because you're choosing to slow down. Your immune system can function optimally because it's not constantly suppressed by stress hormones. Your digestive system can process food efficiently because you're not in chronic fight-or-flight mode. This physical improvement is often one of the first signs that your energetic transformation is working. You might notice that you have more energy, sleep more deeply, get sick less frequently, or experience relief from chronic symptoms that have been troubling you for years. Your body is responding to the decreased stress load that comes from no longer absorbing everyone else's emotional chaos. The energetic ecosystem of your life also includes your living space, your work environment, and the activities you choose to engage in. When you're operating from availability addiction, you often tolerate environments and activities that drain your energy because you believe you don't have the right to be selective about where you invest your life force. You might stay in jobs that deplete you, live in spaces that don't nourish you, or participate in activities that leave you feeling empty rather than fulfilled. As you develop energetic sovereignty through conscious unavailability, you become more discriminating about your environmental choices. You start to notice which spaces make you feel expansive and which make you feel contracted. You pay attention to which activities energize you and which activities drain you. You become selective about the media you consume, the conversations you participate in, and the environments you choose to spend time in. This discrimination isn't about becoming precious or high maintenance. It's about developing what Jung called conscious living, making choices based on wisdom rather than conditioning, responding from center rather than reacting from triggers. When you're conscious about your energetic ecosystem, you can sustain your own well-being while still being genuinely available for meaningful connections and contributions. The practice of energetic hygiene becomes essential as you develop this new level of awareness. Just as you wouldn't let anyone dump physical garbage in your living space, you learn not to let people dump their emotional chaos in your energy field without conscious consent. This might involve practices like meditation to clear absorbed emotions, time in nature to restore your natural frequency, or energetic protection techniques to maintain your boundaries in challenging environments. Some people dismiss these practices as woo-woo or unscientific, but Jung understood that the psyche operates according to energetic principles that aren't always measurable by conventional means. He wrote extensively about synchronicity, archetypal energies, and the collective unconscious, all concepts that point toward the reality of subtle energy exchanges that occur between human beings. Modern neuroscience is beginning to validate what Jung intuited, that human beings are energetically connected through mechanisms like mirror neurons, electromagnetic field interactions, and pheromone communication. When you're in the presence of someone who is anxious, your own nervous system can begin to mirror their anxiety, even if they haven't said anything about their emotional state. When you're around someone who is calm and centered, you often feel more peaceful yourself. Understanding these energetic dynamics helps you make more conscious choices about where you invest your attention and presence. You begin to recognize that every interaction involves an energy exchange, and you become more intentional about ensuring that these exchanges are mutually beneficial rather than one-sided extractions of your life force. The transformation of your energetic ecosystem also affects your creativity and productivity in profound ways. When your energy is constantly being drained by other people's needs and crises, there's very little left for your own creative expression, personal projects, or innovative thinking. You might feel creatively blocked, professionally stagnant, or personally unfulfilled despite being busy and productive in service of others. But when you begin to conserve your energy through conscious unavailability, when you stop leaking your life force through constant accommodation and people-pleasing, you often experience a creative renaissance. Ideas that have been dormant for years suddenly seem possible. Projects that felt overwhelming become manageable. Creative impulses that were buried under obligations begin to emerge with surprising force. This creative flowering isn't coincidental. It's the natural result of having your energy available for your own authentic expression, rather than constantly channeling it into meeting others' needs. Creativity requires a certain quality of availability, not availability to others, but availability to your own inner promptings, intuitive insights, and imaginative impulses. Jung believed that creative expression was one of the most important aspects of individuation. He understood that each person has unique gifts to offer the world, but these gifts can only be discovered and developed when you're connected to your own authentic nature, rather than constantly adapting to others' expectations. The energetic sovereignty that develops through conscious unavailability creates the optimal conditions for this creative discovery and expression. The ultimate goal of understanding and transforming your energetic ecosystem isn't to become isolated or self-absorbed. Though it's to become so energetically sovereign, so clear about your own frequency, so grounded in your own well-being, that you can engage with others from a place of genuine choice rather than compulsive accommodation. When you're operating from this kind of energetic integrity, your availability becomes a gift rather than a given, your presence becomes nourishing rather than depleting, and your love becomes conscious rather than addictive. This transformation of your energetic ecosystem is perhaps the most profound shift that occurs when you become unreachable. It affects every aspect of your life, your relationships, your health, your creativity, your living environment, your work, and your spiritual development. It's the foundation upon which all other transformations are built, because it determines the quality of energy you're working with in every area of your life. One of the most counterintuitive discoveries you'll make on your journey toward conscious unavailability is that becoming less accessible often makes you more genuinely attractive to others. This isn't about playing hard to get or employing manipulative dating strategies. It's about a fundamental shift in the quality of energy you emanate when you're no longer desperate for validation, approval, or connection. Jung understood this paradox when he wrote about the magnetic power of individuation. The process of becoming authentically yourself makes you naturally attractive to others who are drawn to authenticity. The reason withdrawal creates genuine attraction is rooted in basic principles of energy and psychology that most people don't understand. When you're constantly available, constantly accommodating, constantly seeking to please others, you're operating from what I call deficit energy, the frequency of lack, need, and incompleteness. This energy is inherently repulsive, even when it's dressed up as generosity or helpfulness, because it creates an unconscious pressure on others to fill your emotional void. Think about the last time someone was overly eager to please you, excessively accommodating to your needs, or desperately seeking your approval. How did their energy feel to you? Chances are it felt suffocating, demanding, or somehow off-putting, even if you couldn't articulate why. Their neediness, however well disguised, created an energetic burden that you unconsciously wanted to escape from. This is because neediness, even when expressed through giving rather than taking, creates what psychologists call enmeshment pressure, the feeling that the other person needs you to be something specific to maintain their emotional stability. When someone is constantly available to meet your needs, you unconsciously sense that they need you to need them. Their availability comes with invisible strings attached, the expectation that you'll validate their worth through your appreciation, that you'll confirm their value through your dependence, that you'll prove their lovability through your acceptance. Contrast this with someone who is genuinely self-contained, not self-absorbed or selfish, but authentically comfortable in their own skin, genuinely okay whether you're pleased with them or not, truly available by choice rather than compulsion. This person's energy feels completely different because there's no underlying pressure, no hidden agenda, no desperate need for your validation. Their presence feels spacious rather than demanding, nourishing rather than draining, optional rather than obligatory. When you become unreachable, when you withdraw from the constant performance of availability, you begin to emanate this quality of self-contained presence. You stop broadcasting the frequency of need and start radiating the frequency of wholeness. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it's not always linear, but when it occurs, the effect on others is often dramatic and immediate. People begin to sense that you don't need anything from them, and paradoxically, this makes them want to give to you more freely. They feel that your attention is genuine rather than strategic. Your affection is authentic rather than manipulative. Your presence is a gift rather than a burden. The absence of pressure in your energy field creates space for others to approach you from their own authentic desire, rather than from guilt, obligation, or the weight of your unspoken expectations. Jung wrote about this phenomenon in terms of what he called the transcendent function, the mysterious process by which psychological opposites create a third thing that transcends both. When you stop desperately seeking connection, thesis, and embrace periods of conscious solitude, antithesis, you create the conditions for genuine intimacy, synthesis, that's based on choice rather than need, appreciation rather than desperation, mutual enhancement rather than mutual completion. This magnetic quality of conscious unavailability operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Psychologically, it signals to others that you have developed the emotional resources to regulate your own internal state rather than depending on external validation. This emotional sovereignty is incredibly attractive because it promises that a relationship with you won't involve the exhausting work of managing your feelings, reassuring your insecurities, or constantly proving your worth to you. Energetically, the frequency of self-possession draws others who are operating from their own sense of wholeness, while repelling those who are seeking someone to exploit, manipulate, or drain. It's like a natural filter that ensures your connections are based on genuine compatibility rather than complementary dysfunction. The needier someone is, the less attractive your self-contained energy will be to them. The more whole someone is, the more they'll appreciate your energetic sovereignty. Spiritually, conscious unavailability demonstrates what Jung called the opus contra naturam, work against nature, or more specifically, work against the conditioned nature that seeks validation, approval, and completion through others. This work of individuation, of becoming who you truly are rather than who you think you need to be loved, emanates a quality of spiritual authority that others find compelling even if they can't consciously identify what draws them to you. The paradox deepens when you realize that this magnetic unavailability makes you more genuinely available for authentic connection than you ever were when you were constantly accessible. When you're no longer driven by the compulsion to please, accommodate, or rescue others, you can be present with them from a place of genuine curiosity and care rather than anxious performance. Your attention becomes undivided because you're not simultaneously monitoring their reactions to adjust your behavior accordingly. This quality of undivided attention is rare in our distracted, performance-oriented culture. Most people are so busy trying to manage others' impressions of them that they can't actually be present with others in any authentic way. Their consciousness is split between what they're experiencing and how they're being perceived, between what they're feeling and what they think they should be feeling, between who they are and who they think they need to be. When you've done the inner work that conscious unavailability requires, when you've faced your own neediness and developed genuine self-respect, you can offer something that's incredibly valuable, the gift of your undivided presence. People can sense when someone is truly with them versus when someone is performing being with them. The difference is palpable and magnetic. This magnetic quality also stems from what I call energetic abundance, the feeling that emanates from someone who is genuinely fulfilled by their own company, their own interests, their own inner world. When you're not desperately seeking stimulation, validation, or entertainment from others, you have something substantial to offer from your own fullness rather than trying to extract something from their abundance. Think about the people you're most drawn to in your life. Chances are they possess this quality of energetic abundance. They're interesting in their own right, fulfilled by their own pursuits, content in their own company. They don't need you to complete them, but they choose to include you in their world because they genuinely enjoy your company. Their invitation feels like a gift rather than a burden because it comes from overflow rather than emptiness. The magnetic power of conscious unavailability also operates through what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, the psychological principle that irregular, unpredictable rewards are more powerfully motivating than constant, predictable ones. When you're always available, always accommodating, always responsive, your attention loses its value through overexposure. People take you for granted because they know they can always count on your accessibility. But when your availability becomes selective, when your attention becomes something that must be earned rather than automatically given, it becomes more precious. People pay attention when you speak because your words aren't constantly diluted by overcommunication. They value your presence because it's no longer guaranteed. They appreciate your support because it's offered consciously rather than compulsively. This isn't about being manipulative or withholding. It's about the natural law that value is created through scarcity. When something is always available, it becomes background noise. When something requires conscious choice to access, it becomes foreground awareness. Your selective availability teaches others to value what you offer because they can no longer take it for granted. The paradox of magnetic unavailability also operates through what Jung called the projection of the anima animus, the tendency for people to project their idealized image of the opposite sex onto others. When you're constantly available and accommodating, you invite projections of the eternal mother-father, the all-giving, all-forgiving, always understanding parental figure who exists to meet needs without having any of their own. But when you become selectively available, when you demonstrate that you have your own needs, boundaries, and preferences, you invite projections of the beloved, the mysterious, compelling other who is desired precisely because they cannot be completely possessed or controlled. This shift in projection changes the entire quality of how others relate to you, moving from the entitled expectation of unconditional availability to the appreciative desire for conscious connection. The magnetic quality of conscious unavailability is perhaps most evident in romantic relationships, where the dynamic of pursuit and withdrawal plays such a crucial role. When you're always available to a romantic partner, always accommodating their needs, always prioritizing their comfort over your own authenticity, you often trigger what psychologists call the paradox of choice. The more easily someone can have something, the less they tend to value it. But when you maintain your own interests, friendships, and activities separate from the relationship, when you require reciprocity rather than accepting one-sided accommodation, when you demonstrate that you're choosing to be in the relationship rather than desperately needing to be in it, you create the energetic conditions for ongoing attraction and appreciation. This doesn't mean being distant, cold, or playing games. It means being genuinely self-possessed, having a life that you love independent of the relationship, maintaining friendships and interests that nourish you separately from your partner, pursuing goals and dreams that don't require their participation or approval. This self-possession creates what relationship experts call healthy interdependence, two whole people choosing to enhance each other's lives rather than two incomplete people trying to merge into one functional unit. The magnetic power of conscious unavailability also operates through what I call the mystery factor, the psychological reality that people are drawn to what they can't completely understand or predict. When you're constantly available and accommodating, you become completely known, entirely predictable, utterly familiar. There's no mystery left to explore, no depths left to discover, no surprises left to encounter. But when you maintain some energetic privacy, when you don't immediately share every thought and feeling, when you keep some aspects of your inner world sacred and private, you preserve the mystery that keeps others curious about you. This mystery isn't deception or manipulation. It's the natural result of having a rich inner life that doesn't require constant external validation or sharing. Jung understood that mystery was essential for maintaining genuine interest between people. He wrote about the importance of what he called the unknowable other, the recognition that no matter how intimate you become with someone, there will always be depths to them that remain mysterious and unexplored. When you're constantly available and completely transparent, you eliminate this natural mystery and often create the conditions for boredom or taking each other for granted. The development of magnetic unavailability also requires what I call outcome independence, the ability to engage with others without attachment to specific results or responses. When you're desperate for validation, approval, or connection, your interactions carry an energy of need that others can sense immediately. You're unconsciously trying to control their responses, manage their impressions, or extract something specific from the interaction. But when you've developed genuine self-respect and emotional sovereignty through conscious unavailability, you can engage with others without attachment to how they respond. You can be genuinely interested in them without needing them to be interested in you. You can offer authentic appreciation without requiring reciprocal validation. You can express genuine care without demanding that care be returned in specific ways. This outcome independence is magnetic because it's so rare. Most people are constantly monitoring others' responses, adjusting their behavior based on feedback, performing some version of themselves to achieve desired reactions. When someone engages with complete authenticity and no attachment to outcomes, it's refreshing and attractive precisely because it's so unusual. The ultimate paradox of magnetic unavailability is that it makes you more genuinely available for authentic connection than you ever were when you were constantly accessible. When you're not driven by neediness, desperation, or the compulsion to please, you can show up for others from a place of genuine choice and authentic care. Your presence becomes a gift rather than a burden. Your attention becomes valuable rather than commonplace, and your love becomes conscious rather than addictive. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it requires consistent practice and commitment to your own development. But when it occurs, the effect on your relationships is profound. You attract people who appreciate your authenticity rather than your availability, who value your presence rather than your services, who choose you for who you are rather than what you can provide. This is the foundation for the kind of conscious, mutual, enhancing relationships that Jung believed were possible when two individuated people choose to share their lives. After the shattering, after the withdrawal, after the long dark night, of conscious unavailability comes something unexpected: resurrection. Not the return of who you used to be, but the emergence of who you've always been beneath the layers of adaptation, accommodation, and performance. This isn't a going back. It's a coming home to yourself after years of exile in the land of other people's needs and expectations. Jung called this process the restoration of the original personality, the return to your natural state before you learned that love had to be earned, that worth had to be proven, that value had to be demonstrated through self-sacrifice. This original personality isn't naive or unconscious. It's informed by all the experiences you've had, integrated with all the lessons you've learned, but no longer distorted by the desperate need to be someone other than who you naturally are. The resurrection of your true self doesn't happen all at once. It's a gradual process of recognition, acceptance, and integration that unfolds as you consistently choose authenticity over accommodation, truth over comfort, self-respect over approval-seeking. Each time you honor your genuine feelings instead of performing what you think others want to see. Each time you express your authentic preferences instead of automatically deferring to others. Each time you choose solitude when you need space. Instead of forcing yourself to be social, you're participating in your own resurrection. This process often begins with small acts of rebellion against your own conditioning. You might surprise yourself by saying no to a request without elaborate explanation or apology. You might shock others by expressing an opinion that contradicts the group consensus. You might discover that you actually enjoy your own company more than the company of people who expect you to be constantly entertaining or accommodating. These small acts of authenticity accumulate over time, building momentum toward a more substantial transformation. You begin to trust your own judgment more than others' opinions about what you should do or how you should feel. You start making decisions based on your internal guidance rather than external pressure. You develop the capacity to disappoint others without catastrophizing about the consequences. The resurrected self that emerges from this process is both familiar and foreign. Familiar because it's who you've always been at your core, beneath all the adaptive strategies and compensatory behaviors. Foreign because you've been performing other versions of yourself for so long that your authentic nature feels almost like a stranger. You might discover preferences you forgot you had, interests you abandoned years ago, aspects of your personality that got buried under the weight of being what others needed you to be. This resurrection often involves reclaiming parts of yourself that you rejected or suppressed because they didn't fit your image of who you thought you needed to be loved. Your anger, which was banished because it wasn't nice or spiritual. Your selfishness, which was rejected because it wasn't generous or caring. Your wildness, which was tamed because it wasn't appropriate or mature. Your sadness, which was medicated because it wasn't positive or strong. Jung understood that these rejected aspects of personality don't disappear when we refuse to acknowledge them. They go underground, where they continue to influence our behavior in unconscious ways. The angry person who's suppressed their anger often becomes passive-aggressive. The naturally selfish person who's rejected their self-interest often becomes resentfully giving. The wild person who's tamed their authentic expression often becomes secretly rebellious or addictive in their behaviors. The resurrection process involves what Jung called the integration of the shadow, consciously acknowledging and accepting these rejected aspects of yourself. This doesn't mean acting them out destructively or using them as excuses for harmful behavior. It means recognizing them as natural parts of your human wholeness, understanding the gifts they contain, and learning to express them in conscious, constructive ways. Your anger, when integrated, becomes your capacity for healthy boundaries and appropriate assertiveness. Your selfishness, when conscious, becomes your ability to care for yourself so you can genuinely care for others. Your wildness, when channeled, becomes your creative expression and authentic spontaneity. Your sadness, when honored, becomes your capacity for deep feeling and genuine empathy. This integration process is what transforms you from someone who's constantly available out of compulsion into someone who's authentically available out of choice. When you're no longer split against yourself, when you're not constantly suppressing parts of your nature, when you've made peace with your full humanity, you have genuine wholeness to offer in relationship rather than the performance of wholeness. That exhausted you for years. The resurrected self is characterized by what I call integrated availability, the capacity to be genuinely present when you choose to be present, and genuinely absent when you need to be absent, without guilt, explanation, or apology. This isn't the reactive unavailability of someone who's angry or defensive, nor is it the compulsive availability of someone who's desperate for validation. It's the conscious choice of someone who knows their own worth and can engage with others from a place of authentic generosity rather than unconscious need. This integrated availability has a completely different quality than either the compulsive accommodation you used to practice or the defensive withdrawal you might have employed during the early stages of becoming unreachable. It's warm but boundaried, generous but self-respecting, caring but not caretaking. People can sense the difference immediately because your energy is no longer split between what you're feeling and what you think you should be feeling, between what you want and what you think you should want. The resurrection of your true self also involves what Jung called the development of the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to hold opposites in creative tension rather than collapsing into either extreme. You can be both loving and boundaried, both generous and self-protective, both open and discerning. You no longer have to choose between being a good person who sacrifices themselves for others and a selfish person who only cares about themselves. This transcendent function allows you to navigate the complexity of human relationships with wisdom rather than reactivity. You can care about someone's pain without making it your responsibility to fix it. You can feel empathy for someone's struggle without feeling compelled to solve it. You can love someone deeply while still maintaining your own center and refusing to lose yourself in their chaos. The resurrected self has access to what I call conscious compassion, care that enhances rather than enables, support that empowers rather than rescues, love that liberates rather than binds. This compassion is actually more helpful to others than the compulsive caretaking you used to practice, because it comes from strength rather than weakness, from choice rather than compulsion, from wholeness rather than the attempt to complete yourself through others. When you're operating from this level of integration, your very presence becomes healing for others. Not because you're trying to heal them or fix their problems, but because your embodied wholeness gives them permission to be whole themselves. Your comfort with your own complexity allows them to embrace their own contradictions. Your peace with your own imperfections helps them accept their own humanity. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the wounded healer, the person who has faced their own wounds, integrated their own shadow, and developed genuine compassion through their own suffering. This person can be truly helpful to others because they're not trying to rescue them from experiences they themselves haven't been willing to face. They can offer authentic support because they've learned to support themselves through difficulty. The resurrection process also restores your access to what Jung called the creative unconscious, the part of your psyche that generates new ideas, solutions, and expressions. When you're constantly responding to others' needs and crises, your creative energy is always being channeled into external problem-solving rather than internal generation. You might be incredibly productive in service of others while feeling creatively blocked in your own life. But when you reclaim your energy through conscious unavailability, when you create space for your own inner world to flourish, your natural creativity begins to flow again. You might rediscover artistic interests you abandoned, develop new skills you never knew you wanted, or find innovative solutions to long-standing personal challenges. This creative renaissance isn't a luxury. It's an essential part of psychological wholeness. Jung believed that creative expression was one of the primary ways the psyche maintains its health and continues its development. He understood that each person has unique gifts to offer the world, but these gifts can only be discovered and developed when you're connected to your own authentic nature, rather than constantly adapting to others' expectations. The resurrected self also has access to what I call spiritual sovereignty, a direct relationship with whatever you consider sacred or meaningful that doesn't require external validation or group approval. When you're addicted to availability, your spiritual life often becomes another way to gain approval or demonstrate your goodness to others. You might practice compassion because it makes you feel virtuous, engage in service because it proves your worth, or pursue spiritual development because it distinguishes you from others. But when you've done the inner work that resurrection requires, your spiritual life becomes genuinely personal and authentic. You engage in practices that actually nourish your soul rather than those that make you look enlightened. You pursue truth rather than comfort, depth rather than surface-level positivity, genuine transformation rather than spiritual materialism. This spiritual sovereignty allows you to be genuinely helpful to others in their spiritual development, because you're not trying to prove anything or convert anyone to your way of thinking. You can share what's been helpful to you without attachment to whether they find it helpful. You can model authentic spiritual practice without preaching or performing your enlightenment. The process of resurrection also involves what Jung called the return to the world, the phase of development where you re-engage with life and relationships, but from your new level of integration and awareness. This isn't a return to old patterns of compulsive availability, but a conscious choice to share your gifts with the world from a place of fullness rather than emptiness. This return to the world often looks different than your previous engagement, because you're no longer driven by the need to prove your worth or earn love through service. You might choose different types of work, different kinds of relationships, different ways of contributing to your community. Your choices are guided by authentic passion and genuine calling, rather than by what you think you should do or what others expect from you. The resurrected self also has the capacity for what I call conscious intimacy, deep connection that enhances both people rather than diminishing either one. This intimacy is based on truth-telling rather than people-pleasing, on genuine appreciation rather than desperate need, on mutual enhancement rather than codependent merging. In conscious intimacy, you can be completely yourself without fear that your authenticity will destroy the relationship. You can express your genuine feelings without monitoring the other person's reaction to adjust your behavior accordingly. You can have your own needs and preferences without feeling selfish or demanding. You can love someone deeply while still maintaining your own center and refusing to lose yourself in the relationship. This kind of intimacy is only possible when both people have done the inner work that resurrection requires. It can't exist between someone who's desperately seeking completion through the other and someone who's trying to avoid themselves through constant caretaking of others. It requires two whole people choosing to enhance each other's lives, rather than two broken people trying to merge into one functional unit. The ultimate gift of the resurrection process is the discovery that you are inherently worthy of love and respect simply because you exist, not because of what you do for others. This isn't a concept you need to convince yourself of. It's a lived reality that emerges naturally when you stop betraying yourself through compulsive accommodation and start honoring your own authentic nature. You realize that the love you've been desperately seeking from others has been available within you all along, waiting to be discovered beneath the layers of performance and people-pleasing. This realization doesn't make you less loving toward others. It makes you more capable of genuine love because you're no longer loving from a place of need and desperation. When you truly love yourself, not in a narcissistic way, but in the way of someone who has accepted their full humanity and treats themselves with the same compassion they would offer a beloved friend, you have actual love to give rather than the counterfeit version that comes from trying to get love by giving it. The resurrected self understands that authentic love is not transactional. It doesn't keep score, doesn't expect payment, doesn't come with invisible strings attached. It gives because giving is a natural expression of fullness, not because giving is a strategy for getting something in return. This shift from transactional to transformational love changes everything about how you relate to others and how they experience you. Jung understood that this transformation from need-based to love-based relating was the ultimate goal of psychological development. He wrote about the possibility of conscious relationship, connection between two people who have each done the work of individuation and can therefore meet each other as whole beings rather than as collections of unmet needs seeking fulfillment through the other. The resurrection process also restores your access to what I call intuitive wisdom, the internal guidance system that has been available to you all along, but was drowned out by the constant noise of other people's opinions, expectations, and demands. This wisdom doesn't speak in the loud, urgent voice of anxiety or the demanding tone of social conditioning. It whispers in the quiet moments, suggests rather than commands, offers guidance that always serves your highest good and authentic development. When you're constantly available to others, constantly absorbing their energy and responding to their needs, you can't hear this subtle inner voice. It gets overwhelmed by the static of external demands and the chaos of trying to be everything to everyone. But in the spaciousness created by conscious unavailability, this wisdom becomes audible again. You remember that you have an internal compass that can guide you through life's complexities if you're willing to listen to it. This intuitive wisdom is what allows the resurrected self to make decisions that truly serve their highest good rather than just avoiding conflict or gaining approval. You learn to trust your gut feelings about people and situations, to honor your natural rhythms and preferences, to choose paths that align with your authentic values rather than social expectations. The development of this inner guidance system is what ultimately makes you truly available, not constantly accessible, but genuinely present when presence is called for. You can discern when someone genuinely needs support versus when they're seeking entertainment or distraction from their own inner work. You can sense when a situation requires your engagement versus when your withdrawal would be more beneficial for everyone involved. This discernment is based not on rigid rules or defensive strategies, but on moment-to-moment attunement to what's actually happening energetically and emotionally in any given interaction. You become like a master musician who knows when to play and when to rest, when to harmonize, and when to provide counterpoint, when to lead, and when to follow the natural rhythm of the conversation or relationship. The resurrected self also embodies what Jung called the union of opposites, the integration of seemingly contradictory qualities that creates a more complete and authentic human being. You can be both strong and vulnerable, both independent and interdependent, both discriminating and accepting, both serious and playful. You no longer have to choose one aspect of your nature and suppress the others. You can access the full range of human experience as appropriate to each situation. This integration of opposites is what gives the resurrected self such magnetic presence. People are drawn to wholeness, even if they can't consciously identify what attracts them. When someone has integrated their shadow and light, their masculine and feminine, their giving and receiving, their solitude and connection, they emanate a completeness that others find both comforting and inspiring. The resurrection process culminates in what I call authentic availability, the capacity to show up fully when you choose to show up, while maintaining complete comfort with absence when presence isn't appropriate or beneficial. This availability isn't driven by guilt, obligation, or the need to prove your worth. It's the natural expression of someone who has come home to themselves and can therefore create genuine home for others when they consciously choose to do so. Authentic availability has several key characteristics that distinguish it from both compulsive accommodation and defensive withdrawal. First, it's selective rather than universal. You don't try to be available to everyone all the time. You make conscious choices about where to invest your precious life force based on genuine connection, mutual respect, and authentic calling. Second, it's boundaried rather than boundless. You can be deeply present with someone while still maintaining your own center, your own needs, your own limits. You don't lose yourself in others' experiences or make their emotions your responsibility to manage. Third, it's sustainable rather than depleting, because it comes from fullness rather than emptiness, from choice rather than compulsion. It doesn't drain your energy or leave you feeling resentful. You can give generously because you're giving from overflow rather than from deficit. Fourth, it's honest rather than accommodating. You can tell people the truth about your feelings, your limitations, your preferences without sugarcoating or apologizing for your humanity. This honesty creates more authentic connections than endless accommodation ever could. Fifth, it's empowering rather than enabling. Your presence and support help others develop their own strength and wisdom rather than making them dependent on your constant availability. You become a catalyst for their growth rather than a crutch for their avoidance. The ultimate paradox of the resurrection process is that by becoming unavailable to what depletes you, you become more genuinely available to what nourishes you and others. By saying no to relationships and situations that require you to betray your authentic nature, you create space for connections and experiences that celebrate and enhance who you truly are. This isn't selfishness, it's spiritual ecology. Just as a forest maintains its health by allowing some trees to fall so others can grow, you maintain your psychological and spiritual health by letting go of relationships and commitments that no longer serve your authentic development. This pruning creates space for new growth, deeper connections, and more meaningful contributions to the world. The resurrected self understands that this kind of conscious choosing isn't cruel or uncaring. It's the highest form of love, because it honors the truth of what is, rather than trying to force what isn't meant to be. It allows relationships to find their natural level rather than propping them up through endless accommodation. It lets people see you clearly, rather than hiding behind a mask of perpetual agreeability. Jung believed that this kind of authentic living was not only personally liberating, but collectively healing. Every person who does the work of individuation, who faces their shadows and integrates their wholeness, who learns to love consciously rather than needily, contributes to the evolution of human consciousness. They model what's possible when someone chooses truth over comfort, authenticity over approval, genuine love over transactional exchange. The resurrection of your true self is ultimately a gift to the world. When you stop performing versions of yourself designed to gain approval and start expressing your authentic nature, you give others permission to do the same. When you demonstrate that it's possible to be both loving and boundaried, both generous and self-respecting, both open and discriminating, you show others that they don't have to choose between being good and being real. This modeling effect is perhaps the most powerful form of service you can offer. Without preaching, teaching, or trying to fix anyone, you demonstrate through your very being that it's possible to live authentically, love consciously, and be genuinely available for meaningful connection while maintaining your own integrity and well-being. The resurrected self has moved beyond the false choice between selfishness and selflessness into what Jung called the middle way, a path that honors both individual authenticity and collective connection, both personal needs and relational responsibility, both self-care and care for others. This middle way isn't a compromise, it's a transcendence that includes and transforms both extremes. From this place of integration and wholeness, your availability becomes a conscious gift rather than an unconscious compulsion. Your presence becomes genuinely nourishing rather than subtly demanding, and your love becomes truly free rather than secretly transactional. This is the ultimate fruit of the journey into conscious unavailability, not the capacity to avoid others, but the ability to be authentically available when authentic availability serves the highest good of all involved. The resurrection process teaches you that becoming unreachable was never about rejecting others. It was about reclaiming yourself. It was never about building walls. It was about developing healthy membranes that allow nourishing connection while filtering out toxic intrusion. It was never about becoming cold. It was about discovering the difference between genuine warmth and the heat of friction that comes from constantly betraying your own nature to accommodate others. In the end, the journey of becoming unreachable leads you home to yourself, and from that place of authentic self-possession, you can finally offer the world what it actually needs, not another person desperately seeking validation through service, but a whole human being capable of conscious love, genuine presence, and authentic contribution. This is the resurrection that Jung promised was possible for anyone willing to do the difficult, necessary work of becoming who they truly are beneath all the masks, roles, and adaptations they've worn to survive in a world that too often rewards performance over authenticity. Your availability, when it finally emerges from this process of death and resurrection, is no longer a strategy for gaining love, but an expression of love already found, no longer a compensation for feeling unworthy, but a celebration of worth. Already recognized, no longer a desperate attempt to prove your value, but a natural overflow of value already embodied. This is what it means to become truly unreachable, to what would diminish you, and genuinely available, to what would allow you to flourish as the authentic, integrated, whole human being you were always meant to be. Write in the comments, "I choose my conscious unavailability." Let's see how many of you are ready for this kind of revolutionary self-respect. And tell me what aspect of this journey resonates most deeply with you right now. The mirror breaking, the alchemy of solitude, the development of conscious cruelty, or the ultimate resurrection of your authentic self. Your insights might become the foundation for our next exploration into the depths of human psychology and the possibilities that emerge when someone chooses truth over comfort, authenticity over approval, and genuine love over transactional exchange.